You're listening to sermons from La Cañada Congregational Church and Pastor Kyle Sears. Join us in person every Sunday at 10 a.m. in La Cañada for worship. You can find more information about our church online at lacañadachurch.org.
You know, when I have to think about going hiking for miles and miles in the heat, nothing about that excites me. I don't like the idea of having to get ready and put on hiking shoes and sunscreen and all the different equipment that I would need. And yet, if I look back over this past summer, some of the most memorable and favorite experiences I had was hiking miles and miles in the heat. I went to Yosemite with my brother. 10 miles was nothing to get up to Cathedral Lake and back. And then in Rome, Erica and I walked literally tens of miles each day in the heat of Rome. I was sweating so much. I'm sure it was like just pasta sauce and gelato was all that was coming out of me. I did not gain any weight because it was so hot and we walked so much. But if we weren't walking, we were eating. That was basically the itinerary. And so in the last 3 chapters of Ephesians, the writer is going to use the metaphor of walking to help us think through what it means to live a Christian life. And I have to think that there's some part of us that anticipates that endeavor maybe as much as we like hiking miles and miles. Like whenever I say, this week we're going to work on living a Christian life better, you're like, I don't really want to do that. I'd really rather not. But my hope is as we spend maybe a few weeks here trying it out, that we might find that it's really not as bad as we think, and it might turn out to be some of the most hopeful, good, and generous things we've ever done. And so I want to start with Ephesians chapter 4, verses 1 through 16. I, therefore, the prisoner in the Lord, beg you to walk in a manner worthy of the calling to which you have been called, with all humility and gentleness, with patience, bearing with one another in love, making every effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to the one hope of your calling, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is above all and through all and in all. But each of us was given grace according to the measure of Christ's gift. Therefore it is said, when he ascended on high, he made captivity itself a captive, and he gave gifts to his people. Now when it says he ascended, what does it mean but that he also descended into the lower parts of the earth? He who descended is the same one who ascended far above all the heavens so that he might fill all things. He himself granted that some are apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers to equip the saints for the work of the ministry, for building up the body of Christ, until all of us come to the unity of the faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, to maturity, and to the measure of the full stature of Christ. We must no longer be children tossed to and fro and blown about by every wind of doctrine, by people's trickery, by their craftiness and deceitful scheming. But speaking the truth in love, we must grow up in every way into him who is the head, into Christ, from whom the whole body, joined and knit together by every ligament with which it is equipped, as each part is working properly, promotes the body's growth in building itself up in love. And so this is a new theme that is picked up at this halfway point in this letter to the churches around the area of Ephesus. This is a letter that was probably passed along from church to church to be read publicly. And so rather than speaking about specific concerns that many of the other letters in the New Testament does, this is more of a general letter. And it's going to instruct us how we might walk in faith, this sort of deliberate life that has been changed by the peace that is made possible in Jesus. This first half of the letter has this conclusion in chapter 3 that I find to be one of the most powerful expressions of God's history of salvation, the way that God has moved in the world with us, especially in a cosmopolitan region like Ephesus. And this powerful conclusion is how Jesus will heal the divisions that exist between the economic and ethnic and religious and gender differences in their region. That Jesus comes together to pull together what other people have been trying to separate and divide. And we might imagine that if this letter was written today, we would add other categories, that divisions that have fractured our society or our regions or our own ideologies. But within this letter, regardless of whatever may separate us, what the writer is saying is that we are called within the diversity of our existence to cultivate a unity with one another, That one of the ways we live out our faith is by keeping peace with one another. And again, that idea of peace is a sense of wholeness, not just niceness, right? Not just everyone smiling and nodding along, but instead a sense of wholeness, that we are incomplete without everyone bringing something to the table and participating. And cultivating that kind of unity can be a pretty vulnerable thing if you think about it. Seeking peace calls for us to be humble and open, or patient as we embrace others' differences, adaptable as we hear new perspectives, or gentle as we explain our own perspectives with those who disagree. It's far easier to just say, gross, you put ketchup on hot dogs, go away, let's never talk again. Which is gross, but I mean, unless you're like a 10-year-old, maybe that counts, but ketchup on hot dogs is gross. Maybe some people put mayonnaise on it too, but whatever. That's really, where mustard is all that belongs. But there's this line that's at the end of the passage that I find Christians use a lot in order to justify their attitudes of superiority to others. And it's this idea of speaking truth in love. Well, I love you, and so I'm here to tell you that I am right and you were wrong. And it would be unloving for me to let you vote for that person. And if I have to manufacture lies or denigrate you publicly, well, that's better than burning in hell, isn't it? And that attitude often pours out of Christian thinking as an excuse of saying, well, this is just what it looks like to love. The writer is going to say that's missing the point entirely of what we are called to be as peacemakers within God's kingdom. And that perspective that as a Christian, I must know better than everyone else because I found the answer to all of life. It comes from an idea and a theology that God is perfectly unchanging, alone at the top of everything. And then the idea that God has then ordered the world in that same sort of way, that God is the CEO, and as Christians we must be what, like the board of directors? And so we can exercise our power over all the other things because we hold the most important positions. And we should make sure that everyone follows the same rules we follow. There's this idea in some Christian communities that unity under duress is still unity, so that kind of counts. But when we are called to follow God, the way that we imagine God matters because we're going to try to live out the virtues of that God. And so if our imagination of God is centered around absolute sovereignty and a demand for perfection because God is at the top and everyone else is down below, we get a kingdom full of jerks who call themselves Christians. But what if this top-down hierarchical way of understanding God is wrong? See, most of us imagine this sort of faceless being way up there who's ready to sling some lightning bolts if we don't do something right. But Ephesians is suggesting an interplay that is happening between Father, Son, and Spirit. We see this language already appearing long before this doctrine of the Trinity gets formed, a couple centuries later. That we have a Father, as they say, who is above all, but also through all and in all. Not just above all, but through all and in all. We have the Spirit who binds us together in peace, made possible by Jesus' crucifixion that will heal the separation between human factions. Sometimes even within the Trinity, we imagine a hierarchy. It's not good theology. Well, God's at the top because Father, that's better than Son, so we'll put Father at the top. Son and Spirit kind of play along. Spirit obviously is something we don't really talk about in congregational churches, so we'll scooch them off to the side and kind of bring them up whenever we want to talk about them. But really, by putting that hierarchy, we are positioning ourselves to then use that same sense of hierarchy in our own life. Instead, what we find here in Ephesians is this social dynamic at play, an interplay, an openness. And as the writer was saying, this gentleness and humility within the Spirit. Now, how far is that openness and interplay and humility willing to go? In Ephesians, we hear the story of the descent of God in Jesus' incarnation. That the very basic nature of who God is has an impulse to go down into the lower parts of the earth, the way the writer says it. That the love of God seeks to know us in such a deep and personal way as to become us, so that we might know God and therefore know love for ourselves. That the one who had every right to claim hierarchy and power and authority over everything else instead rejects it and chooses a descent that goes all the way from humanity to a shameful death on the cross, to the grave itself. And so what we find is that the love of God opens God up to human experience. You can't get more vulnerable than that. In our imaginations, instead of this unchanging and unblemished God who demands nothing but perfection as it rules from over top of everything, we have one who experiences the diversity of our reality and would be incomplete without it. God would be incomplete without the human experience of Jesus. And so the writer of this letter says that in this ascent from the lower reaches of the earth, that Christ has taken prison itself prisoner, has said to hell with hell, claims captivity as a captive, and then bestows gifts to humanity. You can imagine as this resurrection is happening that there's just this like flinging out of the gifts that God would give. And those gifts are more than just our talents or our titles or our whatever that makes us who we are. The gifts that we get is one another. That's what God bestows us with. And not just one another, but the gifts that we receive are especially given for those who are different from us. Our talents are used to maintain that bond of peace. Those are the gifts that we use that forces us into realities with people who don't see things like we do. And then we use our gifts as apostles and prophets or evangelists or pastors or teachers to help other people do the work of maintaining that bond of peace. It says that those with these sort of titles within the church are there to equip the saints for the work of the ministry. Meaning the saints, and that's anybody who would confess Christ, are the ones who do the work of the ministry. Who work to be together with each other in all of the difficult ways that can be. And so as we grow into Christ and we do this work, we embody this Trinitarian impulse to learn from others with vulnerability and openness. As the writer would say, we're not like children, refusing to taste anything but chicken nuggets and french fries or hot dogs with ketchup on them. We're adventurous in our faith. We exercise new ways so that we can grow up mature and strong. He says we're not easily swayed by lies and boogeymen that seek to divide us and other people so that we can be afraid of the same people so that we can feel powerful. But instead, we work together with Christ as the head of us, and we are the body. And so we really are doing more than speaking the truth in love. We live the truth in love. Not so that others would grow up, not so that we can tell people, well, I'm right and you're wrong, and here's how to get right with God so that I can feel better about myself. But by living the truth in love, it's not to force other people to grow up. It's to help us grow up. To learn maturity. Because we become like the God we follow. And how we love tells us and others what we really believe. How we love tells us what we really believe. Again, it is work to maintain this bond of peace. There's this song called One by U2. You'll hear it in a moment. but it became a way for them to express this rift that had formed between the members of the band as they got successful. And as they got successful, they found that they became a little more judgmental about each other's talents and resentful, that they weren't getting the kind of focus that everyone else was getting. And so they went to Berlin not long after the wall came down and thought if we could find ourselves in a place of reunification, we might then discover, as we write songs in this place, we might absorb some of this capacity. And so in that place, in what Bono would describe as this sort of miracle from on high, the words to this song came to them. And it's a song that's actually kind of like a breakup song. It's a song about how difficult it is to maintain the peace between one another. It's a song about all the hopes that we would have in being together, and yet realizing that diversity can become frustrating. And so my hope is that as we listen to this song, and as we consider our own calling to maintain the bond of peace, that we would recognize that this is not easy. But one of the gifts of Christ is to give us the grace and capacities to practice it and not be good at it, but to keep practicing it and get a little bit better. And that we rely on one another to do that. That we would come back to the confession that's at the beginning of this passage. One faith, one hope, one Lord, one baptism, one grace, one Father who's above all and in all and through all. This is the way that we come to know that love is the highest law. My hope is that we would follow that law as we seek to express what it is that we truly believe. Amen.